Thanks very much for joining us for this session on generative AI frameworks and solutions. I'm very pleased to be moderating this session. My name is Karen Nelson. I'm the Acting Vice-Chancellor at the University of Southern Queensland. I'm joined by some colleagues of mine, Gregor Kennedy, who's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor academic at the University of Melbourne, and David Sadler, who's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor academic at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, and our friend and colleague, Herk Kailis, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Cadmus. So we're here to explore where we're at with artificial intelligence, and my intelligence on my phone just shut down, so I'll just get it open again. So we're 2 years now since really what has been the launch and evolution of generative AI into our university learning environments and its availability as a digital tool for us. So we've brought together some sector leaders and a technology partner to discuss how universities are approaching generative AI, to provide you with some up-to-date learnings on how two of our institutions are approaching generative AI, and to share frameworks and solutions that support sector collaboration, because we're good at that. And particularly as AI and its application in learning and teaching continue to evolve and to challenge the fundamental basis of learning and teaching in our institutions. We're going to try and leave time at the end for questions, and we promise to keep our answers shorter than the advertisement. So firstly, I'm going to go to Gregor. So, Gregor, I know you're passionate about the purpose and role of learning and teaching in higher education, and you've been an early adopter of emerging technologies. How's the University of Melbourne approached AI and its application in education?
Thanks, Karen, and thanks for the invitation. It's a very big question, and I suppose the way that I would start by answering it is when generative AI, and the point was made that AI has been around for a long time, but when generative AI emerged a couple of years ago, I think most institutions, and my institution as well, started with that sort of balance between the risk and the opportunity. And I think we ran pretty hard at the risk with support of TEXA and a couple of leaders in the sector. And really went hard at working out what it meant for us in a risk equation when it comes to education. And then ever so gently we started to adopt more approaches which were, well, what are the opportunities here in terms of teaching, learning and assessment, staff and students. In looking at the approach, if I reflected back on my university in the last 2 years, again, people in the room would know, and certainly colleagues on the panel, there's no sort of one thing that you do here. There's no magic bullet here. And the list of things that you need to do as an institution is long. So, the education of students, getting them up to speed, providing them with advice, professional development of staff. One of the first things we do is look at our policy, our procedures, and see how the implications of generative AI to those governance structures, technology platforms, assessment transformation, having innovation groups of both staff and students. All of these are part of the kit bag, a part of the landscape of dealing with this. So those are the high-level features from my institution, and I think you'd see that across most institutions in the sector. And all of those sort of play a really important role in building a sort of culture in the institution around this, which is ultimately about sort of responsible and effective use of AI in teaching, learning and assessment.
Great, and we'll come back for some more detailed comments later. So, David.
Yeah, thank you. And I have the privilege, I suppose, of not being able to talk about the last 2 years because I've only been at Notre Dame for 10 months. But obviously I've been in the sector a long time. I think what Gregor has said is exactly right, and actually has saved me a lot of time because I was going to say the same thing. And I think the trend between that risk and opportunity is one where we're all on a similar journey. I guess what I would say though, as a DVC, I do have to balance that risk thing, that assurance of the, if you like, the outcomes of learning with an attention to the longer term, so the cultural work with the academic community to ensure, if you like, assessment is authentic, the curriculum design is right, and not lose sight of that when you're in the midst of a burning platform. And that's what I'm going to talk about a bit later.
Great, thank you. And Herk, we've seen a lot of technologies. Can you make some general comments about how emerging technologies that you're familiar with can help universities with not only the challenges of AI, but challenges around perhaps the student experience and learning and teaching more broadly?
Thanks, Karen. I think with emerging technologies, and we've got obviously generative AI as a big example here, there's similar to when the internet came about, there's almost a convenience to say this is going to solve all our problems or do a lot of things for us. I think from a framework perspective, we can think about generative AI within that framework of not replacing what we're doing, but maybe augmenting some of the ways we do things, and maybe in the ways that applies to higher education, it might be how do we think about assessment design, how can we augment that process. It's not necessarily going to change what we do. We still need to assess for the same outcomes. We still need to make sure students have the right skills, but within that framework of how we do those things, I think we'll get a lot of change in there with generative AI, and that'll be an evolution. And I don't think there's a solution for what that looks like in 20 years. I don't think there's a solution for 5 years, really. It's sort of everything's changing, and it'll change more quickly.
And there's opportunities outside the learning and teaching domain too, isn't there? So, Gregor, back to you. So, just drilling down now to a bit more of a specific insight into the University of Melbourne, in particular, the challenges around AI in an educational context and the other AI, academic integrity. So can you give us some insights into what's happening at the University of Melbourne?
Yeah, and I mean, that's again on the sort of risk side of the equation. This is where a lot of us sort of ran early to try and work out, and with the encouragement again from the regulator, from TEXA. And really, I hope we get a chance to talk about the opportunities, but this is really the money question for institutions. I won't talk too much about our particular approach. I can talk in sort of general terms. Our approach is in front of the senior leaders at the moment. We're having a meeting to finalise things sort of on Friday. But if I observed across the sector, the approaches are becoming sort of somewhat consistent, and it's really at the behest of the regulator. Hand on heart, as students are exiting the courses and programs of our institutions, can we say hand on heart that they can do what we say we do? And that comes down to the question of academic integrity. And it really does, and David, I'm sure will be able to talk about this, is focus on assessment and focusing on warranting and assuring assessment. And the parameters of that have become pretty clear across the sector. Whether it's at and this is where the decision making is, had good conversations over the last couple of days about this. Is it at the subject unit level? Is it at the program level? Is a key consideration that, if you sit in a room of DVCAs, spend a lot of time talking about that. And we've got intended learning outcomes at that subject level or at that course level. And most of the conversation is, what is the level of assurance or warranting that you want at either that subject or at that program level, and how do you do that? And most of the conversation is going to how much of that needs to be observed, or how much of it is in dialogue and being observed. And so if you look across the sector, and my institution is counted, this is where you get to the Sydney Track 1, Track 2, or Lane 1, Lane 2, or other lanes. That's what all of that conversation is about. And it's about thinking about the journey of transforming assessment so that it fits into that kind of observed or dialogic framework at the subject or course level, where you use the learning outcomes as a yardstick. That will take a long time, In our institution, we did an audit of 18,000 assessments.
Yeah. And that's the challenge, isn't it, that you were talking about before, David, balancing the sort of burning platform, the crisis, about the assurance of learning with how long it actually takes to reform learning design and assessment. So can you tell us a little bit more and illustrate perhaps with an example from your institution?
So just to give you some sense of it, we're 6 months into a 3-year process of transforming assessment. So what I'm telling you now is really the nursery slope. But having said that, we do have an academic integrity framework, and that framework is all the things Gregor said, but it's also establishing some core principles around education and actually innovation in assessment. Obviously, our governing committees are very interested. We do a twice-a-year report on issues. I would just give you a very quick case study, because this is the burning platform question. One of our largest, well, in fact, I think it is our largest program, is nursing. Before I started in April 24, there was already an uptick in reported cases. By the end of the semester one, that had grown again, and it was running at about 7.6% of all the students. That was enough for a program, particularly one that's got very high competency requirements, for my integrity unit and myself to think about what must we do. So we ran a pilot with Cadmus. It was targeted at the one school. 9 courses in our language, that's a unit or a module. 2,337 students and 109 tutors. Okay, so it's a big pilot. One of the things that I think is missing from the debate is what do we know from research into why students cheat or why they're tempted to cheat. There's some great research out there. Guy Curtis, for example. This example, I think, bears out one of those points, because the students and the staff were kind of demoralised by the way in which the assessment had been structured. And it was using an online exam through the learning management system. And what was happening, students were getting a question one at a time, very quickly disappearing, but also AI was learning the question. So you could see what was going on. There was no opportunity for the students to engage in a deeper process in that. So we brought in Cadmus with 2 goals. Reduction in the number of academic integrity cases and a positive staff and student experience. Bear in mind, this is the first bit of a 3-year stage, okay? So this was very much around the examination, using a lockdown browser so that there was no opportunity to import from outside, working very closely on a weekly basis, Cadmus, with our staff, supporting what they're doing in terms of assessment questions, but also having a progressive engagement with the students. So as they went through, there was diagnostic help coming through. I won't go into any more. There's plenty of material on this, but just to give you some stats. The 7.6% incidence of academic integrity by the end of semester 2, 2024, became 1.02%. We had an 8.8% improvement in the pass rate and a 4.4% improvement in grades, and an 88% student satisfaction rating with their experience. So from our perspective, we had addressed the burning platform, but also had, if you like, improved the learning and assessment experience. So we're in the midst of a bit of a cyber incident at the moment, but once we get out of that, we are going to mainstream.
Let's hear about that, David.
We are going to mainstream the Cadmus pilot across the institution.
Thank you. So another opportunity for us in higher education, isn't it, with the advent of the risks posed by cyber breaches. Yeah. So David's mentioned Cadmus, and full disclosure, our university also is a partner with Cadmus. The detailed way about Cadmus works, and David sort of skipped over it, but there's been a lot of thought gone into it from a learning and teaching perspective. Can you just briefly share with colleagues who don't know how Cadmus actually works.
Yeah, for sure. And we had nothing to do with the cyber incident. We're certified, not certifiable. Yeah, so the tool itself, it's an assessment tool. The big focus is on assurance of learning, and I think that's a big component of this conversation, and shifting the dialogue in that direction I think is really important. And for us, it's focusing on process, our students going through an authentic process to do the assessment. I think the big thing we've seen before generative AI was that a lot of our institutions and educators were looking for assurance of learning and process of learning. Having this big push with AI, generative AI over the last 2 years, it's a technology which has been adopted bottom up by students, and they're really changing the ways we have to behave as institutions. What I think that's then had a knock-on effect into, and where this comes back around, is that students are now concerned with the generative AI piece around, are we going to get flagged up for misconduct because we've now done the wrong thing because we're all now using this tool? And in talking to student groups, it's almost come full circle where students are now saying, well, is there a way we can have assurance of learning to prove we've done the assessment so we can maintain continuous learning through these processes as opposed to changing our behaviours? So I think integrity is one component fitting in with a larger context around learning and assurance of learning. And interestingly, the insight is what educators and institutions were trying to do around that component has now come in line with what students are trying to do as well around, well, can we all prove that we're all going through a learning journey? And if we focus on that big piece, I think we can reduce the issues from there.
Mm-hmm. Great. Before we go to questions from the audience, I just want to turn our attention a little bit to, Gregor, as you mentioned, the opportunities. So there's opportunities around how we educate our students about AI, which will be pervasive in their workplaces, and also capacity building for our staff. Would you like to make a few comments about those particular opportunities?
So, I mean, it's been a topic of conversation that has really gained a little bit of momentum, I'd say, in the last 3 or 4, maybe a little bit longer, where the focus on the risk, and we've talked a lot about academic integrity, academic misconduct and observing assessment. But it's been in the conference in the last couple of days about what we're preparing students for beyond graduation. And a big part of the equation now is how do we educate our students and inculcate in our curriculum and programs an understanding of responsible and effective use of AI. And that is a big challenge. And I mean, Herk remembers the birth of the internet. I remember the birth of the internet, and we had that with information literacy. We had this with Google. We had this with Wikipedia. It's an information literacy question. But then the real opportunity is, if you think about Eduardo and computer science at my institution, how using AI in programming tasks such that it's a helper tool. If you think about health practice, how we're using AI to create simulated cases that are really good practice things for students in health sciences. And the list would go on and on and on. And I think, you know, we've got 13 in our innovators group, which I meet with that group every 3 months to find out what they're doing. The Sydney Symposium last week had a day which was dedicated to people doing interesting things. But students are going to graduate next year, at the end of this year, and they're going to go out into fintech or marketing or teaching, and it's going to be there. And I think that this is a really big challenge for us to work out, not just how we inculcate literacy into the curriculum, which is typically needs to be embedded. It's not a module out to the side. But much more how we're thinking what the future of work is in choose a profession, you know, arts administration, teaching, medical practice, and how we're building that into curriculum is going to be another big challenge for us.
And engaging with industry to understand how they see AI playing out in their industries, into those workplaces where our students go. David?
Yeah, absolutely all of that. And I think the lens of how it assists the productivity of industry, etc., is important. I want to go a different way, and perhaps this is more a perspective that you might expect to come out of Notre Dame, but I want to focus on the human as well, because we will need graduates to have the capacity that marks them out as separate from AI, so that they're able to analyse, synthesise, but also have an ethical and a kind of legal and a theoretical lens on it. So I do think this is the agenda in front of us, which is how the learning outcomes of our courses actually embrace AI rather than shrink from it.
Yeah.
We don't do human at the university, Mel.
Well, it's classic intersection, isn't it, of the humanities and tech.
Yeah.
Herk, thoughts about opportunities?
The opportunities are there if we can make sure that we have things in a framework where students can get to the right learning outcomes. I think one of the big concerns we see a lot of our institutions in the UK and also in the US is a shift towards more exams or invigilated assessment tasks, which I don't think align up to the learning outcomes we're ultimately trying to get students to build towards. And when we get into the workplace, they're not going to be there. So it's how do we make sure the learning outcomes are embedded in the right assessment task where we have assurance of learning in there and we're actually setting up our graduates to be effective. It really does threaten the sector, because if we're graduating 100% examination students and they're going into the workforce, there's no way those two things are going to be in alignment. So I think the opportunity is how do we actually think about assessment learning outcomes within the framework of what's there, and we don't go down that risk profile of, well, it's easy to put them in an exam, students in an exam room and monitor them and know they've achieved a rote-learned assessment task when the skills of the future are not going to be down that pathway.
Yeah, indeed. There are no questions, people. So if you've got a burning question, now's your opportunity. I'm going to ask one more question, though, of the panel. And it's, I mentioned it before, and it's really around staff capacity building, particularly perhaps with some of our colleagues who have been in our institutions for some time and have not necessarily, adopted as quickly as they might have, because we know of that technology adoption curve. There's always going to be people at different places on it. What's happening around capacity building for this professional and academic staff in your institutions to build their capacity to embrace AI and also to manage the risks?
Yeah, so, we had a really big push on this last year where our Centre for Study of Higher Education, our Learning Environments group, put together it's a 101, this is called Navigating Generative AI kind of module. We had the ambitions to get the 700, 800 staff sort of educated on the sort of foundations of that. Last year, I think we got up to 1,000. So there's a certain amount of top-down and there is also, I think because of you see it in the press so much that it's quite topical in conversation, it is maybe one of those changes that that staff are moving a little bit more towards than we would ordinarily see, and I've been in the academic development game for quite some time. Second thing that we're doing is that we had a very successful program of, okay, that's great, I get my head around large language models and how they're different and what needs to maybe consider. We had at their elbow education for people who were saying, this is my second year criminology subject. I sort of get what generative AI is doing, but I don't know, to David and Herk's talking about assessment transformation or teaching and learning transformation, I sort of get that bit of it, but I don't know how to apply it in my local context. And that has been illuminating with the person that's running that saying questions like, how do I log into the LMS and how do I connect to the Wi-Fi? And then the other thing that I'll say, and again, this is pretty common, it's not particular to my institution, is that we've just started to think about, all right, if you've got the foundation stones, what are the scalable, durable, what's the next tier and the next tier of, if you thought of it as a micro-credential, what is the tiered structure that you can ask staff to go through? The real challenge is that dipping into the middle of the bell curve and getting into that 64%. Don't worry about the 15% at the back of the tail. Don't worry about the 15% at the front of the tail. It's the bottom half of the middle, that 34% in the adoption curve, where that's always challenging. And again, I don't have a magic solution to that. But it is one of the things that across the sector we could really share practice in this, i.e. why do we all create our own PD rather than just not create a 101 and then have it as a standard across the sector might be useful.
I have got a question from the floor, and I think it's a great one. So do you think there's an opportunity, and Herk, I'll ask you this as well as David, but that AI can be used to break down academic silos or the silos between, bespoke degrees, disciplines? Is there an opportunity there that is yet to be harnessed around that opportunity?
Almost certainly. I mean, one of the things that's common about my institution is that we do have a core curriculum. And so actually, I don't control that. That's an interesting question. But one of the things that I think we could do is actually look at how across that core curriculum we could weave some of these kind of literacies in, both for the staff that are delivering it as well as the students that are receiving it. And that actually we know that's all of our students. So I think that may not be applicable to everybody, but if you think about what are the big kind of units that you may have, the big courses you may have, it might be a similar type of experience.
Back to you, Greg, and then I'll go to Herk.
Is that okay, Herk?
Got a new one for Herk.
So I think it's a really good question. What we've found we've done a lot with our Associate Deans Teaching and Learning over the last 9 months, and the culmination of that, as I say, is this thing that we're discussing on Friday. One of the things that came out with the Associate Deans, which is a little bit to your point but slightly different, is the areas of communality across, we've got 9 faculties, across faculties that aren't immediately obvious when you think about AI and assessment particularly. So I'll give you 2 examples. The first one is really obvious. The written task, various forms of the written task, but there's a degree of, there's a horizontal across faculties where they're all grappling with that. Some aren't at all, STEM disciplines typically less, but if you think about lab reports or whatever it is, there's a little bit more there. The other one is design artefacts. So we've got a Faculty of Fine Art and Music in the creative industries, we've got a School of Design, and we've got parts in our Faculty of Arts, and not exclusively that, also there's design artefacts in our Faculty of Education. And the way in which generative AI, which is not text-based generative AI, but visual representations and design representations, the way in which they are handled, it was a vertical conversation across those academic disciplines to go, how can we join forces to solve this for design students as well as our creative industry and movie students? And that's a really useful conversation.
Yeah, fabulous. So, Herk, going back to the opportunities offered by AI, and I made a comment before about there are other areas of higher education that has potential, I think, student administrative processes. So the question is about what's the potential, what do you think the potential is of AI to democratise education, improve student support, improve learning outcomes, any one of those, but I'm particularly interested in the democratisation question.
It's obviously where the big opportunities are with AI, with beyond higher education as well. To touch on a few earlier points, which probably tie into this, no technology in and of itself is going to solve all the problems. It ultimately comes down to human beings as well. And I think in institutions which are driven by human beings in particular roles driving a particular discipline, it's possibly a technology alongside those people that can actually open up access to things. And I mean, we see this ourselves. You can put a technology in, if you use it inappropriately, it's not going to solve the issues. And it's the same with generative AI. You put it in, expect it to solve all the problems. It's only as good as the person who understands what's underlying it and then how to use it. And with something like assessment design, which provides such a great opportunity, it's how well do you as an educator understand assessment design? And what we find is very strong discipline-specific academics who are not assessment design experts. And it's very hard, to Gregor's earlier point, to translate, well, I get conceptually what's going on, how do I actually translate that into my local interface? And so what we're trying to look at with technology is how do we drive consistency, quality at scale, and make sure that people are all following the same tenets around what good practice is, so that then those practices are passed along to students. So the opportunities are there, but it's our job, I think, to make sure that people are following the right steps and that they understand what underlies a lot of this, because as an engineer, they don't just give you a calculator and go figure this out. They say figure it out by hand first, and when you understand how to figure it out by hand, then shortcut it with a calculator.
Yeah. We could talk for many more minutes, probably hours on this, but the clock says 10 seconds. So I think it's been an interesting conversation, but we've only really touched the surface of not only what the risks are, how do we approach the burning platform, but that tension between the long game of assessment reform and immediately making sure we've got processes in place to assure learning outcomes and at the same time improve those experiences of learning for students. So thank you all very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.